What's the world's most pressing problem? This question is surprisingly difficult to answer. You'd imagine there was a ranking somewhere where you could simply look up the results, because this question seems to be among the most important ones we can ask ourselves as a civilization. So it's quite reckless that we don't discuss this more often. Don't get me wrong. We do discuss lots and lots of problems. But how often do we stop and ask ourselves which ones deserve my attention and which ones don't? The critical importance of this question is illustrated by the story of this man, James Urbanski. James Urbanski was head of mission for Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, in Rwanda in 1994. The same year that the genocide broke out in this small African nation. Later, Urbanski described the chaos he was thrown into as follows, quote, "There were so many, and they kept coming. Patients were taped with a 1, 2, or 3 on their foreheads. 1 meant treat now, 2 meant treat within 24 hours, and 3 meant irretrievable. The 3s were moved to the small hill by the roadside, opposite the emergency room, and left to die in as much comfort as could be mustered for them. They were covered with blankets to stay warm, and given water and whatever morphine we had. The 1s were carried by a stretcher to the emergency room and the entrance area around it. The 2s were placed in groups behind the 1s. I don't envy James Urbanski for the situation he found himself in. Nobody does. He couldn't save everybody, he couldn't help everybody, because his resources were severely limited. He didn't have enough time, he didn't have enough staff, he didn't have enough medical supplies. And there were so many who needed his help. So he stopped, he took a step back and assessed the situation. He prioritized. And in this, he's not alone. This practice, which is called triage, is common in emergency situations. It's described in manuals for first responders in disaster relief. It's commonly used in emergency rooms across the globe. It's also the reason why we need to ask ourselves the question, what's the most pressing problem in the world? Because fundamentally, we're in a very similar situation to James Urbanski, whether we like it or not. When we look at the world outside, there's many things that are a lot closer to the chaos that James Urbanski described than we want to contemplate during our everyday lives. War, famine, disasters, to name just a few of the catastrophes that still claim the lives of tens of thousands of people every year. We also cannot help everybody. Our resources are also limited. We don't have enough time, we don't have enough money. So we also have to stop, we have to step back and assess the situation. To save as many lives as we possibly can given the circumstances, we have to prioritize. And this might sound cold-hearted at first, but really it's the opposite. This approach springs from a well of deep compassion within us. It's this deep compassion that led James Urbanski to be in Rwanda in 1994 in the first place. It's this deep compassion that led him to try to save as many lives as he could. And it's this deep compassion that leads me to asking the question, what's the world's most pressing problem? And when faced with such a huge challenge, with such a big question, we're tempted to just use our gut judgment. But that would be dangerous. We'd risk subjecting human lives to our own very arbitrary whims. Because our gut is used to do many things, but it's not used to dealing with problems on a global scale. Our answers would be skewed by a whole array of cognitive biases. Our gut thinks a problem is more important because we simply hear about it more often. And in a sensationalist media landscape, that's a very poor guide to decision-making. Our gut also doesn't discriminate very well between large numbers. 1 million victims, 1 billion victims, who cares? It's just many victims, which is clearly dangerous. As a result, our gut thinks shark attacks are the most dangerous thing in the world as opposed to car accidents, which the statistics clearly don't bear out, not by a long shot. So how can we prioritize better, given that the stakes are so huge? There's now a growing movement of young people who have dedicated themselves to answering this exact question. We call ourselves effective altruists because we want to help solve these big challenges. But how do we find them? How can we decide between all of these problems that we find in the world? Effective altruists suggest we should look at 3 criteria when judging global problems: scale, tractability, and neglectedness. When looking at scale, we have to ask ourselves, how many people are affected by this problem? How severely? The reasoning is quite straightforward. We'd rather want to solve a big problem than a small problem. The second criterion is tractability. Here we ask questions such as, are there already proven solutions? How costly is it to implement them? Again, the reasoning is quite straightforward. If there's a big problem, but there's nothing we can do about it, why invest even more resources? And lastly, there's neglectedness. Here we want to ask questions such as, how many people are already working on solving this problem? How much money is used into the solutions that we already found? Because if fewer people are working on a given problem, it becomes comparatively more important that we invest our own time and our own money into solving it. And equipped with this framework, we can again look at the question I posed at the beginning of this talk. What's the world's most pressing problem? And effective altruists have come up with some priorities, but you should treat them with some caution because there's still some uncertainty involved. The first one they suggest is global health. Let's look at scale first. According to the WHO, there are about 5 million people in developing countries who die from diseases that we can easily prevent or treat. Illnesses such as HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, and diarrheal diseases. And as I said, we can easily prevent or treat them. And often, these interventions are incredibly cheap. A bed net that prevents malaria by keeping out mosquitoes at night costs only $5. Incredibly low amount, if you think about it. It's also neglected, which is illustrated by the fact that still, every day, 15,000 people die from diseases we can easily remedy. It's also illustrated by the fact that there's a whole class of diseases that affect over 1 billion people worldwide, which is still known as neglected tropical diseases. The second priority that effective altruists propose is factory farming. And I think there's a good case that this is even more pressing. Let's look at scale. According to the FAO, there are around 50 billion land animals that are raised and slaughtered within the factory farming system every year. That's about 10 times the entire global human population every year. This dwarfs the scale of global health I sketched earlier. We also know the solutions, quite frankly. We can convince people to reduce their meat consumption. We can make it easier for people to become vegan. We can develop technological solutions like clean meat so we don't have to raise animals for animal products anymore. But interestingly, it's even more neglected than global health. We invest only $20 million into implementing the solutions I just mentioned. That pales in comparison to $35 billion we invest into interventions dedicated to global health. Now I know what you're thinking. Not everybody believes that non-human animals deserve moral consideration. But if you're even a little bit unsure, the current system is clearly reckless from a risk management perspective. When so many lives, when so much suffering is on the line, I think we want to err on the side of caution. The third proposed priority are what are commonly referred to as global catastrophic risks. What do I mean by this? Think of climate change, nuclear disasters, pandemics, or certain risks from artificial intelligence. Basically, any events or developments that threaten not just the existence and welfare of individuals alive right now, but of generations down the line. This makes the scale truly enormous, because future generations outnumber the present one by a lot, almost by necessity. Now, it's true the solutions to these are less obvious or less clear than the ones to the other problems I mentioned earlier. But also, some of these are comparatively very much neglected. We only invest about $10 million every year into ensuring the safety of artificial intelligence, a paltry amount in the greater scheme of things, at least. And yes, the likelihood of some of these occurring is quite low. But again, remember the risk management perspective. It's quite reckless because it only takes one politician to trigger nuclear war. So, again, we don't want to play with fire. But why am I telling you all of this? The problems I just outlined sound more like the jobs for governments rather than individuals. But the truth is, you can make a dent in these huge problems. This sounds like hubris at first, but I need you to drop some of your modesty at this point. You should tell yourself, yes, I will solve this huge problem. This attitude is sometimes frowned upon by society because huge achievements are supposed to just fall into your lap. But dedication and effort do make a difference. And individuals, even obscure ones, can change the world. Take Viktor Stanov, for example. Who, you might ask? This fairly unknown Ukrainian man. He was a deputy health minister in the Soviet Union. And it was his lobbying efforts that led to the adoption of the smallpox eradication program by the World Health Assembly in 1959. When this goal was finally achieved in 1980 and smallpox was eradicated, the disease had claimed over 400 million lives in the 20th century alone, and would have gone on to claim the lives of many more people. So arguably, this unknown Ukrainian man has done the most good for humanity in the 20th century. So whenever you think, I can't make a difference, think of Viktor Stanov, who's been lost to obscurity, unfortunately. Now, you won't solve any of the problems in your free time. We will all have to make it our jobs to tackle them, quite literally. If you look at this pie chart, it becomes quite clear that we spend most of our time at work, at least during our most productive years, 8.8 hours on average. So unless we can somehow harness the second biggest chunk, which is sleep, to saving lives, we will have to make do with our day jobs. If you add it all together, 8.8 hours per day, 5 days per week, and so on, you end up with around 80,000 hours during your lifetime that you spend in your careers. 80,000 hours. In light of the problems I mentioned earlier, I should probably say only 80,000 hours. So we really need to come up with smart ways of going about this gargantuan task. And the most crucial insight I can share with regard to that is the following. Gain leverage. When the problems are so huge, we need to leverage a lot of resources to make a dent in them. If you tried vaccinating all children personally, 80,000 hours would simply not be enough, not by a long shot. But what do I mean by leverage? Basically, anything that multiplies your own time, your own resources in some way. That makes money a source of leverage, because you can pay other people to help you solve a problem you find important. That's certainly what Bill Gates did with his fortune. Now, it doesn't have to be your own money. You can also leverage the money of an institution through political office or through working at a big foundation. A public platform can also be considered leverage. When people listen to you, you have a lot of influence over them. You can put problems on the agenda that had been neglected before. You can convince other people to invest their own time and money into problems you find important. Take this TEDx talk, for example, because arguably the biggest problem in the world is that not a lot of people think in these terms about the world. A third form of leverage is research. When you find a novel solution to a particular problem, you multiply the efforts and impact of everybody else working on that problem. Take Norman Borlaug, for example. He was an American agronomist who developed high-yield, disease-resistant wheat varieties. They were crucial to what's now known as the Green Revolution. Without his work, roughly 1 billion people would have found themselves without food during the 1980s. For this, he was later awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So research can really be crucial in tackling some of these huge problems. But what should you do? Simply put, use your comparative advantage. Figure out what you're good at, what you excel at, and use it to make a big difference in the world. Somebody's good at talking to and convincing other people. Somebody else is glad when they can step into the laboratory and don't have to deal with other people. And somebody else might simply be good at, making lots of money and hopefully donating it to a good cause afterwards. When we want to have a shot at solving any of these big problems, we will need all hands on deck, quite frankly. Luckily, you won't be alone. When you dedicate yourself to tackling these problems, you will find a whole group, a whole movement of effective altruists working beside you. And if even a single individual can make such a big difference, the possibilities of a group of dedicated individuals who share the same goal are quite staggering. So let's start today. Thank you.